Hey guys, welcome to Stretch Projects. Today I want to talk about the anatomy of jQuery plugins. Now when I was doing some research for different videos, one of the things I noticed was there's actually not a lot of documentation as to how jQuery plugins should be laid out, other than the basic naming and publishing information provided on the jQuery website. So today I want to give a little overview as to some of the options when it comes to actually laying out your jQuery plugin. So one of the first decisions you'll need to make is what to call your plugin. Now as you can see, jQuery operates first come first served basis when it comes to actually naming plugins. So one of the first things you should do is decide a name and search for it on the jQuery plugin website, and if it's free then you're free to go ahead. jQuery also provides some rules as to how you should name the files. So for example, a file should be called jQuery.pluginname.js. But as I say, the content of this video is more focused on what actually goes inside the plugin. And so the first thing that is possible to do within a jQuery plugin is to actually check if the plugin exists. In this instance, I'm trying to check if a plugin called plugin anatomy exists, and if it does, I want to return. I don't want to load the plugin again. And this, like so many of the other actual parts of this video, is optional. If you don't want to check if the plugin already exists, that's fine, but you do run a risk of overwriting another plugin with the same name. The next thing that we do is to actually add the plugin to jQuery, and this is done using the fn function. And you actually just add an anonymous function with any variables in the function line, and everything within your plugin should be contained within this. Next up I have use strict here, just because I want to demonstrate that you can comply with ECMA standards. If you do want to do this, however, make sure that you add the line within the scope of your plugin and not outside. If you're using other plugins, for example, from other developers, and you had use strict outside of the scope of your plugin, you could cause their plugins to break if they don't comply to the standards. So it's best to just use that within the scope of your own plugin. Next up, we have some variables that we're going to use within our plugin. These will be accessible throughout the scope of your plugin, like any variable would be. Any of the children can access the parents' variables. Next up we have some settings. These are set through the options, which is part of the actual plugin and instantiation. Now settings is traditionally just an object with the actual settings within it. One thing that you should note here, however, is that if you are using settings, they should be defaulted to allow the plugin to fail gracefully. Next up we have some functions. Now it is possible to use just the more traditional style of functions. However, it's also possible to use the anonymous style of functions, and I would actually encourage you to use the anonymous style wherever possible. And this is because when you're adding methods to your plugin, it's possible to use this style, which is basically the same as the anonymous style, whereas it's not possible to use the more traditional style to add methods directly. On the topic of methods, it's also important to note that it's possible to assign methods after a function has been created. So in this instance we've created an anonymous function here and we're assigning it to a method here. I would also discourage against this as well, because it just creates more possible points of failure for your plugin. Next up we have some just normal code within the body of the plugin itself. This will obviously be executed when the plugin's first run. This is just to show that it's possible to do things without actually using the functions, but you can access functions just as you would normally. And finally we have this switch action. Now in this instance we ask the user for an action and a value when they're calling the function. So this function would be executed if the user passed across function 1 when they're calling the plugin, and then the values would be pulled out of the value and passed across to the actual function. Now this is a perfectly valid way to do it, but I would again discourage against using this, and instead I would just pass in the options for the actual plugin itself. And the reason for this is because it's a lot easier to use methods to actually manipulate your plugin later on, rather than passing in lots of variables under the same headings, which can then make your code quite brittle. Now, one of the final things that I wanted to mention was using return this. If you use return this within your plugin, you can transform your plugin from basically a very functional plugin like this, where you pass function 1 across with some values, which then obviously executes that command, into something like this, where you can start to chain methods together, and obviously manipulating objects one after the other in a particular sequence. Now, these are just a few of the many things that you're able to do with jQuery plugins, and I would just suggest that if and when you are writing plugins in the future, just consider the options of what you're actually going to want from your plugin before you go too far ahead with actually writing the code. If you're going to want lots of methods, then it's normally better to start from the start, actually using the format that you're going to want to use. So you don't want to be rewriting your function many times as your plugin actually evolves. You want to get it right first time. And the final thing I wanted to say is try to be consistent with your code. If you're going to use anonymous functions, you're able to use methods a lot more cleanly because it's the same layout, it's the same format. If you're going to start switching between traditional functions and methods, things get a lot more messy a lot more quickly, and the future maintainability of your code does deteriorate. If you'd like a copy of this code, it's all available on GitHub. If you have any comments or feedback, please leave them below. Thanks for watching.